I grew up at a time when the world was much smaller in many ways, and what I mean by that is that we didn't travel very far beyond our small communities. My hometown is only 50 miles, about an hour from Regina, and that is close in today's thinking, but when I was a young child, we only went there about 4 times a year, and mostly that was for medical appointments and also school supplies when we used to have to buy all our books. And it was a big deal to go there. Now that I live here, we probably are in Regina at least that many times, if not more, and we live 3 hours away. I remember as a child that most, if not all, of my classmates in school had never been on a plane. To travel by plane anywhere was a big and rare deal. But nowadays it's common for our neighbors, family, friends to travel across the country, the continent, even the world, for family events, for vacation, for work. So if you think about your life, there are probably many things that have changed, but that have also surprised you as well, such as the distances we travel to access services, entertainment, business, family events. For example, as you know, Anna and I now have children who live in Toronto and London, England, for example. Who would have thought or imagined that when they were born? There are many changes that have taken place in life in the past many decades. Sometimes more dramatic and significant changes have taken place amongst this past generation than maybe any other generation in history. Travel is one thing, but think about the technology and the communication as another. We, for example, Anna and I can talk weekly via Skype to our son and fiancé in England and see them live on our computer screen and for no extra cost. Amazing. But there are other changes in life that take place as well. There are changes in us, and we find ourselves doing tasks or jobs or volunteer activities that we would have sworn we would and could never do, but there we are doing it. It's the play this weekend, as you know, and I remember a person who was one of the first performers in one of our first plays, and at the beginning, as you might remember, the first many were all musicals at the start, and I remember her telling a group of us later about the first time she stood on stage for the first performance. She had agreed to be in the play. She was a good singer, and I asked her to be the lead female singer. And she did that. She practiced with the cast, and she learned her lines, and she learned her songs. And she said, when she stood on stage for the first time that first night, she said, she thought to herself, what are you doing up here? What were you thinking when you agreed to do this? You can't sing, you can't do this. She didn't think she sang that well. She didn't think she could stand in front of people and do those lines. But later, in this talk she gave to us, she said the play was one of the most significant things she ever did, encouraging her to try something new, building confidence in front of others, creating friendships, and meeting people, even within the pastoral charge, whom otherwise she would have never met. There are changes within us that surprise us as well over time. Not only doing things we thought impossible, but discovering new attitudes, new ways of thinking that might be life-giving or freedom. Well, I'm sure that the early church after Easter would have said similar things to us. They would never have imagined the places they would go, the people they would meet, the tasks they would do, the new understandings, attitudes, and experiences they would have as a result of following the risen Christ. Today we have such a story from our reading from the book of Acts, which Diane read for us. And the book of Acts, as you know, is written by the gospel writer Luke. And this is the story about Philip and his encounter with the Ethiopian official. So first of all, who's Philip? Philip's one of 7 individuals called into what we call now the diaconal ministry. Originally, this was to help for the care of the poor members of the church, particularly the widows and orphans. And the church at this early time had grown to include Greek-speaking Jews as well as those from Jerusalem who were probably Aramaic-speaking. And there was conflict, a little tension, about the fair distribution of food amongst the widows and orphans between the two ethnic groups. So these 7 were chosen to be in charge and solve the problem. Philip has been chosen. We understand, therefore, that he was Greek-speaking. He was seen as one of faith and wisdom and insight. He was a respected leader of the early church. And that's probably the first surprise for Philip, that he's trusted with responsibility in this new community of faith. Have you ever had that experience where someone trusts you to do something? You thought, well, when did I become that person? I was once at Presbytery many years ago, and they had a discussion about something, and they said, in reporting back, they said, we solved this problem. We invited some of the elders of the press group to come on the conference call with the executive to sort out the problem. And I was one of those elders, and I remember thinking, how did I get to be an elder in the press group? When did that happen? Have you ever been surprised when you were called? I'm sure Philip was surprised. The next surprise would be when he was forced to leave Jerusalem. In the early Christians at the beginning, they remained in Jerusalem, and they were simply another little sect or group within Judaism. But after a time, there was persecution of this new group by the authorities and by the mobs who felt that their way of life, their traditional religion, their safety was in danger because of the ideas and actions of this new group. We learn from Luke, for example, if you read back a few verses in Acts, that there was a violent stoning of Stephen, and then the persecution widened. It says in Acts 8:1b, that day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Now the third surprise is, as a result of this persecution and forced fleeing from Jerusalem, Philip finds himself in Samaritan territory, sharing the good news of Jesus. There's a powerful and positive response in Samaria. Healings are accomplished, the message and story of Jesus shared, and many Samaritans respond with faith and are baptized. The fourth surprise comes when the Spirit calls Philip to leave Samaria and head down a rarely traveled road away from the main thoroughfares. And along this road he comes across a wealthy-looking chariot containing an exotic-looking man, a black Ethiopian of high rank. The Ethiopian was a servant, a member of the government of Candace, the Queen of Ethiopia. He was the treasurer, we're told. He'd been worshipping in Jerusalem. Now, in ancient times, there were Jews in Ethiopia from long before. This man might be a Jew from far away, who knows? Or he might be a Gentile. What we do know, and what Luke emphasizes, is that he was a eunuch. And he calls him that in the passage several times when he describes him. Now, it was common to make boys into eunuchs and train them up to serve in the governments of royal houses in much of the ancient world. As a eunuch, he would be seen as acceptable and harmless to work amongst the women of the royal court. But as a eunuch, the Bible in Deuteronomy says he's unacceptable to enter the temple in Jerusalem because he was considered damaged, not whole, having been sexually mutilated. If he was a Gentile, he would also have been limited in his access to the temple, only being allowed into the very outer courtyard of the temple to pray. But he seeks to worship and know God, and hence his long journey to Jerusalem to pray, we are told, at the temple. Now, we also know that he's a learned man because he's reading. We know he's a wealthy man because of the clothes he wore and the fact he rode in chariot, because he actually had or owned a scroll of the Bible. Now, in those days, silent reading had not been invented yet. People didn't do it. So people always read out loud, even to themselves. And that's why, in the story, Philip, coming upon this chariot by accident, could hear him reading, and he knew what he was doing and from which book he was reading. And the book the Ethiopian official is reading is Isaiah. This is a book that Jesus drew upon a lot in his ministry. And in this part of Isaiah, we have the servant songs, which speak of the suffering servant of God. So Philip comes near the chariot and asks if the man understands what he is reading. The Ethiopian invites Philip into the chariot, and Philip interprets the passage. Now think about it. The Ethiopian official would know a lot about humiliation, injustice to himself and his world. The passage is powerful for a foreigner, a eunuch, someone not fully accepted in the temple, one who knows about suffering. And verse 32 to 33 of Acts, quoting from Isaiah, says, "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." So Philip says this passage describes Jesus, the humiliated Messiah, the one led to slaughter on the cross like a lamb, the one who does not speak in anger, hatred in the face of his accusers, the one who does not beg for mercy in fear and terror, the one who trusts in God's love, whose life is taken, but who was raised from the dead, vindicated, in other words, by his rising from the dead by God's power. Now think about that interpretation. How powerful that would be, how encouraging those words would be for someone like the Ethiopian, who would know a lot about not being fully accepted, fully welcomed, fully loved. So the Ethiopian then asks, he says, look, here's some water. What's to prevent me from being baptized? And there's a lot in that me. And so they stop the chariot by the water, and Philip baptizes the man. And we're told the Ethiopian continues on his journey back to Africa, rejoicing in his newfound faith and acceptance by God's love. And Philip, it says, is snatched away by the Spirit. And Acts continues telling us that Philip found himself in Azotus, in another region. He proclaims the gospel to all the towns until he comes to the Gentile town of Caesarea. So in this story, the Spirit leads, not only sending Philip to many places, but meeting many people far beyond the traditional Jewish synagogue or temple. And what is more, the Spirit challenges and changes the assumptions of Philip, the other apostles, and the early Christian community. You see, Philip never imagined he would meet a powerful, wealthy, exotic Ethiopian official from the royal court of Queen Candace. Philip would never imagine that he'd be teaching and sharing the good news of Jesus with foreigners like Samaritans and Ethiopians. Philip, along with the others, would never have imagined how their ideas about God, about life, about Jesus, about their purpose in the world, about the world around them would change so dramatically. But see, that's part of the impact of the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus, you see, is not just about something that happened to the first century Jesus who lived long ago. But the resurrection is also about what happened to his followers. In many ways, just as dramatic. What happened to them was that the Bible was reinterpreted. Foreigners are now included in this new faith. Jews and Gentiles become brothers and sisters in the church. Biblical references to exclusions for eunuchs, women, outcast Gentiles are set aside with a new understanding about God's welcoming embrace, which had always been included in the Scriptures, but was mostly downplayed. This new understanding called the early community of faith something radically new in the world. They were called to be the embodiment of welcoming, accepting, healing, justice-based, peace-filled, joy-filled, death-defeating love from God, which had been revealed and available in Jesus. They were to create a community of faith that would be open to the Spirit of God, who would call them, challenge them, transform them, and place them in many surprising places and circumstances for the sake of the gospel. Now, as you might know, in the Hebrew language in which the Old Testament part of the Bible is written, the word for wind and spirit is the same, ruach. And certainly in the book of Acts, we see the wind of the Spirit come to the first Christians at Pentecost, blowing away their fears and sending them out of Jerusalem to spread the good news. The early Christians, like Philip, seemed quite good to being open to the Holy Spirit, quite willing to be blown into new places, new opportunities, new challenges, new insights, new travel plans. In our modern world, the church often feels like it's being blown about by many forces. Some forces are good, some forces are very threatening. But even when the winds that blow are not from God, such as when the persecution of the early Christians forced them out of Jerusalem, as Acts tells us, the winds of the Spirit continue to be at work even then, blowing them into new places and opportunities, such as Philip, who found himself with the Samaritans and the Ethiopian official. So the message of the early church to us today, I think, is this: be open to the surprises and the refreshing winds of the Spirit. Take advantage of the opportunities and the challenges that we face. We as modern followers of Christ are called to be open, to be blown about for a while. For it is when we are open that opportunities, life, love, and the Spirit is found. Where is the Spirit blowing in your life today? Where is the Spirit blowing in our church life together? Let's pay attention. Let's be unafraid. Let's be surprised. Let's grow in faithfulness. Amen.